Veterans of the armed forces make up approximately 30% of all mesothelioma diagnoses in the United States. And that proportion, that high rate of incidence of mesothelioma in the veteran population is not a coincidence. Asbestos was used throughout the military, especially in the Navy and on naval ships, but also in the Army, in the Air Force, in the Marine Corps. Asbestos was a lot of places. And we are going to be talking about that in today's episode, about why it is that veterans are so much or at such a higher risk of developing asbestos-related diseases. So if you or someone that you're related to is a veteran and they are struggling with breathing problems, this episode is for you. Welcome to the Asbestos Files, where we expose corporate greed, cut through the confusion, and fight for people who deserve answers. My name is Sophie Zavalia. I'm a trial attorney at SWMW Law, where we believe that when corporations put profits over safety, that people deserve a fighter in their corner who's willing to stand up to corporate greed. Today's episode is about the military and about our service men and women who have a higher risk of developing asbestos-related diseases. First, we have to understand why it is that veterans are at a higher risk of developing a mesothelioma or a lung cancer or a whole number of asbestos-related diseases. Asbestos was used in a number of different ways throughout the military. And if you watched one of our earlier episodes, you will recall that one of the properties that made asbestos so useful, and one of the reasons why asbestos was used so frequently, not only in the United States, but globally, is because asbestos is really great at doing several things. The primary thing that asbestos is great at is preventing people from getting burned. So it's a very excellent insulating material and prevents people from getting burned when they're handling hot items, and it also prevents fires from breaking out. So because of the heat-resistant properties of asbestos, and also because asbestos was very cheap in the 1960s and the 1970s, and also just because it was everywhere and very easily accessible, the U.S. government used asbestos-containing materials throughout the military. One of the highest risk environments that used a lot of asbestos was in the Navy and in shipbuilding. And so one thing that you can consider when you're thinking about this type of exposure is the nature of a naval ship. So this is essentially something that needs to be almost like a city within, one place that's going to be going out on the ocean. And so anytime you have a lot of service members in one place, you're going to need it to be a fully functional unit. Included in that, there are energy needs, for example. And so naval ships had boilers on them. They had piping running throughout the ships. They had a lot of equipment that needed and generated heat in order to power the ship, in order to power the equipment that was on board. And anytime, again, that you're dealing with something like a boiler or with any sort of equipment that generates heat, you're going to need some sort of insulating material to prevent the people on the ship from getting burned. And that's where asbestos comes in. Asbestos was used in a number of different applications. Number one being that insulation that we talked about. Not only insulation that went on boilers, but also insulation that went on pipes throughout the naval ship. And then also in insulating materials like gaskets and packing that went into equipment like pumps and valves, of which there are hundreds on any given ship. In addition to things like boilers, you also have to consider the heat associated with things like engine rooms, engines that powered the ships, and all sorts of other equipment that just made the ship run and made it functional. For this reason, and because ships were so heavily loaded with asbestos, there is a risk not only to the service men and women who served aboard the ships, and one of the things that comes to my mind is we've heard from many different clients who say that even in their sleeping quarters, for example, their bunks were underneath a lot of piping that was insulated throughout the entirety of the ship. So it's not just the servicemen and women who were working down in the engine rooms. It wasn't just the people who were tending to the boilers. It wasn't just the people who were working on things like pumps and valves. It also was just through the exposure and being in a closed environment and serving aboard those ships. And, maybe you accidentally hit some insulated piping. And if you know anything about asbestos insulation, after a while it can start to crumble if you even so much as bump it a little bit. So that's one of the risks to servicemen and women. But even for people who did not serve in the military but worked in industries that served the military, and so these are places like shipbuilding facilities, shipyards, the people actually building the boats that would eventually become these naval ships, those people are at risk as well, because they're the ones who are installing these pieces of equipment. They're manipulating materials. They're cutting into insulation pieces. They are cutting gaskets to size. They are packing valves with asbestos-containing packing material. And so in this way, and this is one of the unfortunate realities of dealing in this litigation and dealing with figuring out different asbestos exposures, is that it's not just the servicemen and women who have served aboard. It's every single industry that goes into helping not only build, but put those ships into commission. And then subsequently, anytime those ships need to get repaired, anytime there are overhauls on the ship, and just, basically, in other words, anytime those ships are getting repaired, anytime the equipment on board is getting repaired, those are all exposure points that can put people at risk of being near asbestos-containing materials and asbestos fibers, breathing them in, and then eventually getting sick. The Navy was not the only branch of the military, however, that puts a veteran at higher risk of developing an asbestos-related disease. You can look at other services in the military, such as the Army and even the Air Force. Through those two branches of the military, the Army, for example, one of the highest exposure points for asbestos in the Army are in things like motor pools. So again, if you've listened to any of these episodes in the past, you might recall that one of the main industries that used asbestos was the automotive industry. And this is true for military motor pools as well. And so we think about in a civilian context, a person might be exposed to brakes that contained asbestos-containing material, clutches that contained asbestos-containing materials in things like passenger vehicles and trucks. And that's a meaningful exposure point on its own. But when we shift our attention to what people were exposed to in the military, we need to not only consider those same types of materials like brakes and clutches and friction materials, but put it on a much bigger scale. And so we're not just talking about, civilian cars and civilian pickup trucks, of which those were serviced in the military as well. But then we're also talking about brakes and clutches on a much larger scale in things like tanks, military vehicles, and much larger sort of, not exactly industrial, but military grade friction materials that would be used. And again, anytime those materials are getting changed out, anytime that they're being removed, there's going to be a deterioration of that asbestos-containing material, such that when you begin to remove those brakes and remove those clutches, there are going to be fibers and dust that are generated from that service on those vehicles. And whether it's visible to the human eye or not, there's going to be an asbestos dust that's released from that maintenance activity. People who worked in motor pools, people who worked on Army, vehicles and pickup trucks and tanks, they have a higher risk of being exposed to asbestos through that work, especially if they are serving in the military in the 1960s, the 1970s, and even through the 1980s. One thing that I think a lot of people don't realize is that many brake manufacturers in the United States continued using asbestos in their brake materials through the end of the 1980s. Some companies even continued using asbestos in their brake materials up through the 2000s. And so I think a lot of people don't realize that. And so we're not just talking about the 1960s or the 70s. We're talking, if you're in the military and doing work on military vehicles up through the 1980s, maybe even into the 90s or the early 2000s, there's still this potential of being exposed to this cancerous material. Additionally, if you shift your attention to things like airplanes, same deal. It's a different type of vehicle, right? It's a much larger type of vehicle, but we're still talking about a vehicle that is moving at very high speeds that needs very heavy equipment to help it stop. And that's where brakes come in, for example. And even though it's pretty common sense, okay, if you put an airplane into the air, somehow it's got to stop, right? That's where those brake materials come in. And again, widely contained asbestos in those components through the 1980s, through the 1990s in certain cases. And so again, when we, like at my law firm, for example, when we have a client come in who served in our military, that's one of the exposure points that we look at, is how often were you doing this work? And basically any time a person is doing work on any sort of friction material, any sort of insulation, any sort of component part that's going into another piece of equipment that either protected against heat or was meant to stop some sort of equipment that's in motion, those are all exposure points that are going to be relevant for how a person may have gotten exposed to asbestos and gotten sick as a result. This is also true in the Marine Corps. Again, we're talking about the same types of equipment and potential exposure points through things like ships and other vehicles that were used in the Marine Corps. In terms of, a lot of people who talk to our firm, they will ask us questions like, okay, well, what type of rating is the most likely to be exposed? What type of service members have the highest risk? I think anybody basically who's working on equipment in a certain time period is going to have the potential of having an increased risk of developing an asbestos-related disease. Some of those ratings that we certainly have seen through my law practice are things like boiler technicians, machinist mates, hull maintenance technicians, anybody working in the motor pool, not only the Army, but also in the Marines, anybody who's working in construction, either directly for the military or as part of a military base being constructed, for example, and any type of servicemen or service people, rather, who were doing maintenance on vehicles, planes, any sort of aviation mechanic, for example. Those are all types of service people who are at an increased risk of developing an asbestos-related disease. If you are somebody who is a veteran and you have recently become sick and it comes out that you've been exposed to asbestos or you suspect you've been exposed to asbestos, you might also be wondering what your options are in terms of compensation. And my own personal belief, and certainly our firm believes, that you should seek whatever compensation that you are entitled to. The two main ways that we have seen veterans become compensated through an asbestos-related illness, and these aren't, you either get one or the other. These usually people are getting both. There's either civil litigation, which would involve something like what my firm does, filing a lawsuit, and then there's also going through the VA and filing a claim through the VA. And I want to talk a little bit about those two different ways that you can get compensated for just a moment. So let's talk about the VA. The Veterans Administration does an amazing job for our servicemen and women who need medical help. And there is a way for veterans to seek disability benefits through the VA for service-connected diseases like mesothelioma. There's a lot that goes into filling out those forms trying to, needing to prove that your disease is connected. And certainly mesothelioma, again, there's no other recognized cause of mesothelioma in the United States other than exposure to asbestos. But there are obviously paperwork requirements and different sort of procedural hurdles that you'll have to go to get those benefits. But that is one option that's available to our veterans who have gotten sick. The other is through civil litigation. And again, that's basically just hiring an attorney who's going to be in your corner to not sue the military. That's not something that we're able to do in civil litigation generally, but to sue the companies that actually made the products. And so one thing that you may not know is that the same companies that were making products for civilian uses, so piping insulation, boilers, pumps, valves, all those things, companies were making those products not only for use in just normal civilian industrial use or even residential use, but some of their equipment that they were making also was for the purpose of the military. And so if you ever do file a lawsuit and you are a service member, your attorney very well may sue the exact same companies that are making pumps and valves and boilers and piping insulation that they may sue if you did not serve in the military, because those companies a lot of times made products for both civilian and military use. One of the main things that we want to make sure that our clients know is that these two types of avenues of benefits, of seeking benefits, whether you go through the VA to get a disability benefit or whether you hire a lawyer, a lot of times people are concerned, and rightfully so, that they can only choose one, right? That they either can get VA disability benefits or they can seek a lawsuit. And there's a lot of confusion, and understandably so, about why someone might be worried that they can only do one or the other. And so we get calls, for example, from people who are currently receiving VA disability benefits, who depend on those benefits, who cannot go without those benefits. And there's a fear that if they hire a law firm like mine, that they will lose those benefits, or that somehow the VA will come and take those away. And that's just simply not the case of how this litigation works or how it affects other benefits. So just one thing to know, these are not things that you either have to choose one or the other. Normally when we get involved, when our law firm gets involved, we have our clients receive both, basically, and make sure that their disability benefits are protected at all costs. Another thing to note is that veterans don't have to file a lawsuit necessarily. There's a whole range of administrative trusts, asbestos bankruptcy trusts, which we talked about briefly in a previous episode. You should check that out if you haven't already. But if, for whatever reason, if a lawsuit is not right for your particular set of circumstances, but maybe we think we can get you compensation through an administrative way, we pursue all avenues. And any asbestos attorney who is worth your time is going to be doing the same thing as well. There are lots of different ways that we can get compensation for our clients. And one of them is through filing a lawsuit, but it's not the only way. One other thing to point out when we're talking about this process of kind of how we get compensation for veterans specifically, one thing that's very important that you need to know is that there is a clock that starts at the time of diagnosis. And so, in other words, one of the main ways that we look at whether or not we can file a lawsuit, whether or not we can do anything for any client that comes through our door, is we have to look at what's called a statute of limitations. That is just a legal term for basically saying, look, if you know you've been injured, you have a certain amount of time, depending on what state you live in, to file a claim. And that if you do not file a claim by the end of that time clock, that you're out of luck. And so the unfortunate reality, and thankfully this doesn't happen incredibly often, but a lot of times we will get people who come to our law firm who were diagnosed with a cancer, let's say 5 years ago, or maybe more likely it is the children of of people who have passed away from cancers, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And people come to us and say, like, hey, I just kind of put two and two together. I realized that my dad served in the Navy, his, for 15 years or for 20 years or whatever it is. And I know he worked with asbestos containing materials and he died of mesothelioma 10 years ago. Can I do anything about that? And the answer in that instance is unfortunately probably not, because most states have a time limit of anywhere from 1 year to, in the state of Missouri, for example, we have a 5-year injury statute of limitations. If a person dies, sometimes the statute of limitations is shorter after a person dies, so it might be 2 years after death. So that's why it's really important that when you have any suspicion at all, and especially if you have a condition like mesothelioma, that there's frankly no other cause that's recognized in the United States, that you call somebody who's experienced in these matters to determine whether or not you have a case at all. And in one of our episodes, we'll be talking about kind of, that whole aspect of what is a case worth, and how do you know whether it's worth pursuing, and we'll talk about that. But the bottom line being that every state has a different time limit, every state has different laws, and that's why you need to contact somebody who knows kind of how these things work in this industry, because even for seasoned attorneys, these rules and regulations and the ins and outs of asbestos land are incredibly confusing. And if I'm being perfectly honest, even for somebody who's been doing it over a decade, sometimes it can be confusing. So that's why you need a great fighter in your corner for this. Next, we're going to shift gears and answer some more of your questions that we have gotten in the Ask Sophie segment. The first question I have today was, I was in the Navy 40 years ago. Is it too late for me to file a claim? Well, the answer is not necessarily. So like we were talking about earlier in the episode, it all depends on when you're diagnosed with a compensable disease. And when I say compensable disease, that again is just sort of legalese for, do you have some sort of injury that we can relate to asbestos exposure? So mesothelioma is one of the classic diseases that is related to asbestos in the U.S. Lung cancers also are caused by exposure to asbestos, esophageal cancers, laryngeal cancers, and then also asbestosis, which is just basically a medical term for lung scarring, and it affects the way that you can breathe, and that lung scarring being related to breathing in asbestos. So for somebody, if I had somebody come into our office and say, hey, look, I was in the Navy 40 years ago, is it too late for me to file? Well, my first answer to that is not necessarily, because it depends on when you were diagnosed. And so that's the first thing that we look at. Once we figure out, let's say this person came in and they were diagnosed with an asbestos-related disease within the last year, then, or maybe they were diagnosed 2 months before they came in, then that's at least the start of the analysis of whether or not we can file a claim on their behalf. But certainly it wouldn't be too late. That's, again, and I've said this before, and I'm sure I'll be saying it a lot of times over the course of this podcast, but it all depends on your particular set of circumstances. And you need somebody who's knowledgeable about this litigation to be able to ask you the right questions. But just on its face, just serving in the Navy 40 years ago is not a bar to recovery. What's really going to matter is when you were diagnosed with a disease, and then what you can remember about the types of products that you worked with. I will add that the good thing about, exposure in the military, to the extent that you could call it good, is that there are a lot of records for the military, right? A lot of records that noted what type of equipment was on ships, and specific ships, and what boilers were aboard, and what pumps and what valves. All of those types of pieces of equipment had to be approved by the military, had to be, the right specifications for it to get put on any type of naval ship or be used as a military vehicle. And so even if you don't remember off the bat all the equipment that you worked with, if you know what ship you served aboard, in other words, we can look up those records of that particular ship and see what specific brands of boilers and pumps and valves and air compressors and all sorts of stuff were approved for use on that particular ship. So just something to throw out. Next, a question was asked. My father was a shipyard worker, but was not in the military. Does any of this apply to him? So the answer is yes. So as we talked about earlier, just because you were not actually in the military does not mean you cannot get compensated for work that you did with asbestos in service of the military. And so there are plenty of companies that worked as government contractors who built bases that would have used, in the construction industry, for example, insulating materials for houses or, building the military vehicles themselves, all sorts of kind of, what you might think is sort of the periphery around any sort of military operation that was not military specifically. That does not bar you from getting compensation. It just requires us to do, again, a little bit additional legwork of trying to figure out what, whether we have records on where that person worked, whether they remember or can tell us what type of equipment they worked with, brand names, and all of that. But certainly, just because you were not in the military, even if you were working around the military and were exposed to asbestos, that can be enough to file a claim. And finally, a question was sent in. Can I pursue both VA benefits and a lawsuit? The short answer to that is yes. There are a lot of different processes for us to pursue, a lot of different ways for us to pursue compensation for people who have been exposed to asbestos that do not, one doesn't affect the other, in other words. And so, again, we know, just based on our service to veterans, that a lot of veterans depend on disability benefits. They depend on the benefits that they have gotten through their service to the military. And filing a lawsuit is not going to affect those benefits or get those benefits taken away. So I appreciate the questions that people sent in. That's really great. Continue. If you have any other questions, please send them in. I'm going to put the contact information for our firm in the show notes. So check that out and let us know what you want to know in our next Ask Sophie segment, Ask the Lawyer. And that's it for today's episode. I really appreciate you listening. One of the most rewarding parts of doing this work is serving our clients. And especially when our clients are people who have sacrificed their lives, essentially, so that the rest of us can live in this country and be free. It just makes it that much more meaningful for us to do this work when we are serving people who have given everything to their country and unfortunately have gotten sick as a result of that service to their country. And so all that to say, I appreciate you listening. That's it for today's Asbestos Files. If you or someone that you know has been diagnosed with an asbestos-related disease and you want to talk to somebody who knows how this litigation works, check out our contact information in the show notes. Visit our website at swmwlaw.com. At my law firm, SWMW, we believe that people matter and that people deserve an advocate on their behalf. I'm Sophie Zavalia, and I appreciate you listening.